At the studio with Kitchen Theory today, we have Professor Marianna Obrist, Professor of Multisensory Interfaces at University College London, Computer Science Department, and Deputy Director of Digital Health at the Institute of Healthcare Engineering. Marianna, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks very much for having me today, Yusuf. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have you here because we met, I believe it was in 2017?
I think that might be right. Yes.
At the Food and Computing Symposium, was it?
Yeah, the future of computing and food in Tuscany, wasn't it?
It was.
Yes, very beautiful environment with the vineyards and all the kind of representations of the local food and wine region.
So that was a fascinating, I guess, symposium or experience. What was it? It wasn't a symposium.
No.
Because I remember there was a manifesto written that came out of this. What was it?
So it was a Future of Computing event, which was sponsored by ACM, Future of Computing Academy. ACM is the global international leading organization for computing machinery. And basically, I was selected as one of the future computing fellows. And we were allowed to explore new topics. And so for me, really excited to bring together computing and food and how they can be married or not be married and bring together a variety of different stakeholders. So it was an event, a workshop, if you will.
Well, what really fascinated me about attending that kind of an event was, I guess as a chef, and as a chef who's interested in multisensory experiences and multisensory dining and flavor, you always think of it as a very human, very kind of visceral sensory activity of eating. It's very hedonistic, it's very a kind of human experience. And so technology being involved in that mix seemed kind of, well, quite new to me, quite frankly. But after having attended, that really changed my perspective. And one of the real interesting ideas that came out of attending there was the work that we subsequently did with Dr. Kirill Veselkov working on the Hyperfoods project, where essentially we were identifying cancer-beating molecules within everyday foods using his research at the Dream Lab. And that door would have never opened had it not been for you inviting me along as a keynote speaker.
Yeah, no, that was exciting to have both of you there as keynote speakers because, as you just described, they are quite opposite. They're the opposite end of a continuum. You have computing on one end and food on the other side. You have the very sensorial, the experiential descriptions and experiences, and then you have the often very cold and clean and systematic, rational way of computing on the other end. And so, because of my background in human-computer interaction, there has always been both involved. You have the human and you have the computer, and I'm focusing on the interaction that creates the experience. So I want to take into account what we experience, this is sensorial, experiential experiences with food. How can we recreate or take inspiration from that work in the way how we build future machines, future computing interfaces, because that's where the exciting bits come. And that's where multisensory experiences and interfaces really kind of blossom over the last decade, I would say.
So before we go any further, how would you, just for those who are listening or who are viewing, how would you define multisensory experiences?
It's a very good question. And I have your permission to read out our definition of multisensory experiences, which I developed with Carlos Velasco as part of the book we wrote on multisensory experiences, where the senses meet technology. And I should add that was published just before the pandemic, which was interesting because when lockdown started, a lot became more pressing on how our senses actually play an important role in everyday life and how technology doesn't quite satisfy that kind of need for sensory engagement. But let me read out this
Let's have the textbook definition.
Because Carlos and I spent so many months and so many discussions just to have that one kind of set of definition. So multisensory experiences are impressions formed by specific events whose sensory elements have been carefully crafted by someone. For example, to create the impression of a sunflower, colors, shapes, textures, and smells are considered. And the senses are placed at the center of the formation of the impression of the sunflower, even in the absence of the real flower. And I'm emphasizing the even because that is where technology comes in. You don't need the real flower, and you might be able to recreate this multisensory experience of a sunflower using emerging technologies.
Wonderful. So how is technology, what is the potential for technology to kind of bridge that gap? How and I'm not just talking about the technologies maybe that we have today, although that would be interesting to kind of learn a little more about, but what is the kind of potential, what excites you about this field of work and research?
Well, the most exciting part around multisensory experiences is its richness and complexity and all the parts that define us as humans. Because although I'm based in a computer science department, I think we need to develop computing systems that really kind of make better use of the capabilities we humans bring into this relationship. I mean, if you think about technology, it makes very good use of our eyes, hearing, and maybe even sense of touch. We have monitors, we have headphones as we're wearing them, but also we can feel vibrations through our mobile devices, which give us certain signals. But what about our other senses, like our sense of taste and smell? They're extremely powerful, but how are we using them? And sure, every time I talk about that to my students or colleagues, they say, why would I lick my screen? I wouldn't say you need to lick your screen, but how can we think about designing taste interfaces that can really kind of fit in a technical ecosystem that has advanced over the last century, really, exponentially? Why do we miss out on them? Because you have this fine-tuning and multifaceted aspects of what sweet makes you feel like or sour makes you feel like, and when you then create flavors, how they really make you either happy, surprised, maybe curious. And that's, I guess, what you as a chef also play with. And so can we bring a little bit of technology in there as well? But it needs to be an experience that someone likes to have and not tubes in your mouth or in your nose. So, and that's kind of what fascinates me. How can we create those interfaces, but also the experiences?
So I understand how technologies can relate to, as you said, things like what we hear, what we see. But when it comes to things like the chemical senses in terms of what we taste and what we smell, how can we recreate like this whole idea of, as you said, kind of licking the screen? That's not maybe a desired effect, but being able to transmit flavor or in a digital sense, that's an interesting idea. And the closest I've ever come to an example of that was, and you'll know who I'm talking about, that they created the kind of sour taste that you could put on your tongue.
Rana Singh's work, yes, with the
Yes.
blades, with the electrodes.
Exactly,
Yes.
and you put it on your tongue. If I'm honest with you, for me, they said, oh, this will kind of stimulate sourness. What it did is it felt like licking a battery. And I wouldn't say that's a necessarily sour taste, which begs the question about basic tastes, and if that wasn't sour, what was it? But it certainly wasn't bitterness or sourness, but it was something akin to those. But is there a possibility of, one would say, kind of manipulating, I guess, the chemical senses to deliver flavor sensations?
So it's a really good point that the example with the electrodes stimulating your tongue or other tube solutions, they are not the solutions I see in the future. But we also need to remember that gustatory, taste-based interfaces are in a very embryonic state, really where I think 100 years ago displays were. And I think these are first attempts of very crude prototypes and devices to try to simulate a chemical sense, which is extremely complex. But I think what we are trying to do is, on one hand, creating devices so we can better study also people's perception, experiences, how they start describing them, and then hopefully iteratively improve them. And maybe that's not the electrodes on your tongue, but maybe it's an implant on your teeth. And then we can modulate that maybe. And it's not necessarily that you recreate reality as we know it, because it's extremely complex. But what if we can create completely new experiences which are otherwise not possible or imaginable? So I think that there are different ways of looking at it. You can either try to completely mirror, or you can say, well, everything is possible now, and you don't need to stick what our tongue can perceive.
Battery-flavored chicken.
Whatever you desire.
Okay. And because as you're talking about this, I'm just thinking that in a way, as a chef, I'm sitting there thinking of all the kind of potential fun you could have at the dining table, how you could, really, as you said, almost create experiences that may otherwise not be attainable. But that's all the kind of, let's say that's all the more kind of entertaining kind of ways that you could use this technology. What are the more practical kind of applications where this kind of technology could genuinely have a benefit to those who are using it?
So that's a very good point. A lot of multisensory interfaces or experiences are designed for entertainment, for immersion. They might be one-off experiences we try, but that's because that's the industry which is mostly supporting these novel explorations. But what I think is where really a great potential lies is in the health and well-being domain, because let's just think about all the people who have taste and smell distortions or disorders. So you can't taste if this is salty, if this is sweet, or if this is a strawberry flavor. So can we try to substitute those lack of taste and smells we take so much for granted through using technology and stimulating, giving them the impression of a certain strawberry flavor by adding a smell or a visual. So it's like almost trying to have the tools which allow you to establish, first of all, what does taste and smell mean in a computing context, but then start creating new mappings and new interactions that on one hand can help people to substitute, another creating new experiences, or maybe even train children to eat healthier, because we all know they might not like their greens, but if the greens they smell or look or feel like, with their different textures we can manipulate, more palatable, more novel, exciting, they might eat their broccoli more than they would otherwise.
That's a fascinating idea, and actually a very early example of a technology interface that I saw related to food was when I visited Professor Charles Spencer's lab in Oxford back in 2011. And it's escaped me now the name of the visiting academic that he had in his lab at the time, but it was a Japanese gentleman who essentially had created this MR, kind of mixed reality display where you could put like a dollop of ketchup on a plate and he could recolor it. So as you were looking at this screen, it looked like it was green ketchup. And even as you moved it around, it would move and it appeared to be green. He could even manipulate the texture so that you could make the ketchup look creamier in some way, like a mayo kind of texture. And as a chef, this was really interesting to me because you thought, oh, well, that's interesting in the sense of you could take cheaper cuts of fish, turn them into sashimi that look visually like a piece of tuna, let's say, or a much higher value piece of fish, just by augmenting the visual aspect of it. And I guess the interesting question being, would that result in a greater level of appreciation by the consumer, right? If they think, if what they see is tuna, but really what they're getting is, I don't know, catfish, will that give value to it in some way?
It's a very interesting point because there are two sides to it. On one hand, you can start manipulating, and maybe even if we don't take the tuna, if we take something else where people maybe have more aversion to, like
Insects?
insects.
Yep.
Sorry, if you think about insects, when you see them, they might not be something people would easily eat, at least in a Western environment. But what if you can do some projection mapping on top of it and you make them look different? Would people be more willing to eat them because they're more, palatable, more attractive, more exciting? So you can play with that. But the other hand is like, do we manipulate people? Do we cheat people? Because if you manipulate what they eat, what they're seeing, and then what they're eating, they most likely believe more what they are seeing rather than maybe what they put in their mouth, and then you can charge them even more. So it's that kind of ethical responsibility, but at the same time, well, it's a good thing if you want to reduce salmon fishing or whatever specific species is what you want to help out, and encourage people to eat some other fish which is more plentiful available. So there is this kind of like, there's no one answer, and it's not just black and white. There is always, what is the situation? Where am I doing that? Is it in an environment where people are aware what I'm doing, or they will be made aware afterwards? Or is it something people are not aware and then they believe something which is actually not true? So Carlos and I spend a lot of time in our book actually talking about this challenges, but also opportunities around multisensory experience design in our final chapters, which can come with ethical and moral considerations in a way.
When it comes to delivering multisensory dining experiences, I guess one of the things I'm always very aware of when I explain what we do and on the research side is it's not about manipulating people's senses. I see it as augmenting, I see it as enhancing, I see it as adding value to their flavor experience, as opposed to when people kind of think of adding different sensory elements that in some way perhaps you're manipulating, they're being tricked into eating things. And where is that line, I guess, with technology? How do you manage that? How because there are no ethics in place for that. How does one go about developing these technologies, but as well making sure that we're not selling, cheap, dog meat and calling it Wagyu beef and making it look like Wagyu beef, smell like Wagyu beef, have the texture of Wagyu beef? How do we control that?
That's a really important point and very interesting question. It's not that I have an answer, but one of the things I started doing over the last 2-3 years is getting involved more with responsible innovation and applying a responsible innovation framework to our development of multisensory interfaces. So where you try to kind of early on anticipate and reflect about potential consequences, including desired but also negative consequences of the innovation we are proposing. Like one paper we published was around touchless technology. So where we are working with ultrasound-based tactile stimulation. It's basically using ultrasound in order to create tactile sensation in midair without any physical contact. And we already demonstrated that you can convey emotions through this technology, and you can do many more things, from shapes to kind of messages and information. So one question.
So just to clarify, you can put your hand there and feel something in midair, and you get the tactile sensations along your hand that could give you the shape of a glass being in your hand, or a handshake.
Yes. So basically, it's an array of ultrasound speakers, which are modulated in such a way that they are not just dispersing us if you stand in a concert in front of the speaker and it just gives you these vibrations on your body, but they are modulated so they are creating a focal point. and that focal point becomes perceivable. It's like when you're taking a straw and you're blowing through the straw on your palm, and that's the feeling. And then you can have multiple straws, and you can create a circle, or you can create like a globe or a glass. But because it's ultrasound and sound waves that are manipulated, it's obviously fuzzy. So if you have a glass of water like you have in front of you and you feel it, you might make that connection, this is a glass. But if you don't have any visual stimulus, you might not even know, is there a sharp edge or not, because there is no sharpness. It only stimulates our receptors in the hand, in the skin, which are related to vibrations, the Meissner and the Pacinian, but not the others. But it's a fascinating kind of technology which allows, because of its ambiguity and fuzziness, to explore more concepts. And we applied it in science communication and in emotion communication and in mindfulness meditation recently as well. But one of the questions that came up when we brought all the developers in that space from our project together was like, well, we can now create, for example, the handshake of the future or the hug of the future. So can we store that hug? Can we change my handshake so it's stronger when I give it to the person on the other end of my Skype call? Because we can? Or is that cheating? Is that kind of manipulating? Or do we refer to augmenting, enhancing our digital self?
I've enhanced my handshake.
And then 2 weeks later, you meet that person in person and shake the hand, and it's different. What will it make us feel? When should we allow it? Do we need to notify this is augmented or not? So there's a lot of questions, and we as developers and designer of those technologies and then also experiences, we need to set certain rules in the interface. When you use Photoshop, you have a gamut and you know where the colors should be in order to fit into the color gamut. But no one tells you what you can design. I mean, you can design your wedding invitation or you can create something which is offensive. So how do we deal with that? And it's not a single developer's responsibility. It's a societal responsibility. And as you said, we don't have this legal frameworks in place. Only like recently, the social media framework has been put in place, but very late considering when Facebook or Meta now or other social media platforms have been basically swarming our everyday life and defining the younger generations. So I guess there is not a real answer. It needs to start in the education. It needs to start telling those developing new interfaces that they should anticipate potential negative consequences. And I'm not saying to stop innovation because that would put a block on everything, but we just at least need to know if that consequence really materializes, what can we do in order to mitigate any misuses or any further negative consequences? And so that's obviously then related to how we design the software for the control, the hardware design, access, and so on. So yeah, it's a process that needs to go hand in hand with the technology development, but also with a public conversation. And that's why in our book, we started that dialogue at the end because Carlos and I are extremely excited about multisensory experiences and what it can bring and enhance our everyday experiences in life. But it also depends who has the control, who is designing, who is the someone who is deciding who gets the fish which is real or the fake one. And that is something we just need to keep having that dialogue because there is no clear one answer.
So let's look at kind of more positive use cases, right? And you were mentioning a few moments ago about this idea of how we could use digital technologies, perhaps in education for children, in nutrition. That got me thinking about as well use cases in let's say, for example, because I remember speaking with Professor Spence about potentially doing some research in this area of children who have who are in the process of undergoing chemotherapy. And obviously one of the kind of issue that, or one of the areas that the researchers were looking at was the children's nutrition. And it's a source of, well, quite a bit of anguish for parents, I guess, because if your child's sick, well, that's a hard enough situation to be in. When they're not eating well, or and they're, you know, I guess parents feel that food is maybe one of the few things that they can do to have an impact to help their child in some way. And you think, but it's very difficult because when you're undergoing chemotherapy, obviously there's a lot of, you know, results and impacts of that physically on the body. And obviously, interestingly, a big part of that is a loss of, in many cases, not all cases, but I mean, I've spoken to a few different people who have undergone chemotherapy, and not everyone loses their sense of smell and taste, but I'd say it seems to be a pretty common occurrence that you lose your sense of smell and taste. So in a situation like that, where is the potential for this kind of technology?
Yes, so that's, I mean, I don't know this space well enough, but I do know that there are the effects on our chemical, on our sense of taste
But
and
how
smell.
could we use technologies then maybe to enhance experiences for people who are, and this could result, this isn't just for, I guess, undergoing patients undergoing chemotherapy. You could look at this as well for those who are anosmic. You could look at the elderly who, well, we're all losing or our sense of smell is depleting in some way.
No, I was going to say that, yes, this is a case where there is a great potential and links back to what I said, where it's not just entertainment, but there's health and well-being. And I think, and related to our aging population, but also other examples with eating disorders, which is a increasingly big societal problem. I think one of the solutions of technologies that comes to mind is sensory substitution again. So it's really, I mean, when you lose one of the senses, you might still use your abilities and other sensory modalities and their particular characteristics in order to help have some sort of experience. It's the best example I can give where I was actually working on with blind and visually impaired people is like, how do you think of a blind and visually impaired person, not just of a person that needs technology solutions that bring you from A to B, but that also allow you to talk about what you're wearing and compliment you about your new haircut, because that's what defines us as humans as well, and social interactions. That's where we start conversations. And equally, if you don't have a sense of smell or taste, how do you describe the different flavors and the experiences you have? And obviously there is a difference between those who are born without that sensory ability and those who lost their different sensory abilities later in life, because they still have their memories. But when I joined one of the Fifth Sense conferences, which Fifth Sense is the charity supporting people with smell and taste disorders, it was crazy to hear about the individuals saying they walked into the room and they were astonished because they felt they were the only people in the world having that problem. But suddenly were 100 more people who shared similar experiences. And another kind of striking anecdote, one woman was saying that she's, I think, 18 or 19, and she was not having a sense of smell since birth.
Wow.
And she still gets perfume as a present for her birthday from her parents.
Wow.
Because there is a lack of understanding also of what does it mean to live without your sense of smell, or maybe also because there is still hope from the parents that she might finally smell. So
That's crazy, because I guess that's the same thing as kind of, you know, buying a a visually impaired person, I don't know, a coloring book or something that's very visually based,
Yes.
right? And to think that, I guess, her parents, because yeah, you're right. Although I would say now, on account of COVID, there's probably been far more awareness in the last 4 years or so around anosmia and the impact that that can have. Being
I
a
agree.
chef who works in multisensory stuff, loads of people have shared their stories about the horrors and fears that they had. And it's ranged from everything from people who lost their sense of smell for anywhere between 3 to 4 days, all the way up to 6 months in some cases. I actually had a very close friend of mine who loves his food, loves his wine, loves, you know, the finer things in gastronomic life. And for a good 6 months, couldn't bring himself to even enjoy a glass of wine. It just didn't have any of the complexity and the nuance that he gets, that satiety and that enjoyment from, that exploring a bottle of wine. And you know, if you're a wine drinker, you'll kind of get it. But it was interesting to hear from his kind of perspective, because he kept me updated over the 6 months as to how it was progressively kind of coming back, and the different notes that he was starting to kind of pick up, and some of the almost smell training, I guess you would call it, that he was doing in order to try and, I think for him, because he was, after about a couple of months of this, he started getting really worried about, what if I'm just anosmic now? So any little thing that he could smell, he would try and kind of whole exercise that, right? Now, you've done enough research in this kind of field to know what the impact can be, but what have you, how would you describe that to people? What is losing your sense of smell? How does that impact people?
Yes, I think it's very timely, because we are running this project right now on smell care, which is basically a digital smell training for your nose. Like you're exercising maybe your muscles or just go for a walk half an hour every day. We encourage people to train their nose twice a day. We refer to it as the nose gym. It's maximum 5 minutes. We have created like a setup which is very simple. We're using a scent delivery device developed by OW, Smell Made Digital, and an app that controls the device and the delivery of the scent towards your nose through an app. Very simple interaction, and it records it over time. And so you do this nose gym or smell training twice a day, and we gave it to households in London and Norwich. The Norwich cohort is still ongoing, but the London cohort with 12 households just finished. And basically they had it for 6 months. And so over 6 months, you can record all your nose gym data, and you can also look at how well you're doing over time, and we correlate it with different contextual information, if you're living alone, how your mood is, how your emotion is, the time when you're doing it, and so on. There's a lot of data we are having. But the interesting bit there is we have two groups of people. One group of people, they have no problem with their sense of smell. They're healthy. And the other group of people, they have lost their sense of smell and they're trying to recover it. They have some form of, they can smell sometimes something, but it's really about the recovery. And
I guess that's it as well. It's a scale, right?
there's a scale, there's also a continuum, because there are different forms of smell disorders. So you can have anosmia or you can have phantosmia, and there are other kind of...
What's phantosmia?
Where you have phantom smells. There is no smell as such, but you think you're smelling something. And so again, there is where we work with our two clinicians, and they are the experts, ENT experts, and they know all about, well, those different types of smell disorders, because they also do surgeries for some where they think it is a solution to maybe regain their sense of smell. But others, like with head injuries, you might actually not regain it. And if you have viral infections, with some training like smell training, you may speed up your recovery. But then there are many others as well. There's a relationship between smell disorders and mental health as well, and diseases of chemotherapy and so on. So there are so many variations, so many causes for smell disorders. And one of the other things we particularly focused on is aging. As we age, we all lose some of our sensory abilities. Our eyesight declines, our hearing, our walking is also getting
But
worse.
it's interesting because you have aids for all of those, right?
You
like
have-
your eyesight, you have glasses, your hearing, you have hearing aids. And I'm just going back to even like my back in the 80s and 70s, these were things that were around, walking cane for, your...
Exactly.
But I guess when it comes to your chemical senses, there are no aids really.
Exactly. And that goes back to our earlier point about, well, you have this kind of new interfaces and devices like the tubes in your mouth or the clips around your tongue, but they are not quite the aids we want because they are quite stereotyping as well. But then again, all the kind of taste and smell innovations, they are still embryonic or very early infancy stage. Compared to our hearing aids or visual aids or other kind of supported as we age. So I think we will have them definitely in the future, but I think the complexity of the chemical senses is contributing to the fact that it's not so clear what the primaries are. Like for taste, we know we have the basic taste, although there are discussions for further basic taste. For touch, we also know what are the main receptors, and for hearing and sight, we also have some reference points and RGBs and the frequency range. But what is that for taste and smell? So, I mean, there's a lot of efforts around what is the RGB for smell and taste, and can you even start classifying them, or is that not possible? Because there's a lot of lack of understanding still from a neurological point of view as well, and the receptor part.
See, I'm fascinated by that because I've, for years and years, had that kind of question around the fact that, when it comes to color, you have range and scale and intensity and the tone and the depth. You have so many ways of looking at sound and color in terms of ranges, right? There's not just the color red. You look at Pantone and you think, well, no, there's a very broad range of what one would call a red color. But when it comes to taste, we talk about things almost in absolute terms, like it's salty, or it's sweet, or it's sour. And I guess that kind of feels limiting, right? Because we know that there are ranges of these things, and we know that the saltiness that, let's say, you get from something like samphire is going to be different slightly than obviously the saltiness that you're going to get from just regular table salt, or that you're going to get from, let's say, pink Himalayan salt or lava salt, right? But nonetheless, we would say it's all salty. And I guess this then brings me to this idea of, can you ever, with the chemical senses, classify these things? And because it's so highly individual as well, because I guess on a genetic level, you taste saltiness different to how I taste saltiness or bitterness or sourness, or and even with aroma, that we will maybe have different thresholds for picking up different aroma compounds. Doesn't that make it really, really difficult to then classify? But then again, I guess you could say with colors that, do we all see the same red, right? Yeah.
True. I mean, I always say I have a whole career to fill with all the challenges in this field. And even all my PhDs, they will have a career in that space. Because it is so challenging, but it's also so fascinating because there's different facets, and they are so defined by us as individuals, where we grow up, our cultural background, our social background, and they are changing over time. They are dynamic. They are not static. Just because today salt X is salty in intensity 9 out of 10, maybe in a week it's only 7. And that's either because you had something else in advance of tasting the salt, or because you're feeling less happy and that affects your perception, or someone else
Or the environment you're in as well,
exactly,
potentially.
the humidity, the temperature, whatever. So there are so many factors that influence, and that makes it extremely challenging. Will we achieve to kind of have a reference as we have the color Pantone or the RGB? Well, I think including us, there are a few groups in the world who are trying to really push forward for that in the space of smell, where we try to identify these primaries. And one of the first steps we tried to make was also to identify, okay, what are the spatial, the temporal, the chemical, and the emotional responses. So what are the dimensions we care about from a human-computer interaction perspective? Because they are different maybe from what a chef would decide be kind of important. So what's the minimal kind of different dimensions we want to start with? And then you can add more dimensions as you go along. But it's kind of a mapping exercise. And I mean, we don't have the final results, but hopefully in the next few years, we provide something which provides a bit more guidance, at least to map out that space around smell, and then also allows us to engage more with it. Because one of the interesting things you mentioned is salt. Whatever version you try, it's salty. But that's also because we don't have the language for it. We don't talk about I don't know, go to university and find a smellology or gastrology master. I don't think you will find it in a computer science department or engineering department, but you can find graphic designers, you can find sound designers. So when we start understanding and mapping out that space, we can build tools and ecosystem, we can train the future generations, and then we can explore the space much better and map it out even more. So if you take a really far leap 50 years from now, I'm pretty sure that there will be much more than we can say about salt than just salty. It will have a more fine-grained description space.
Yeah, and actually, as you just mentioned that, I was just thinking with sweetness even, we call it all sweet because that's linguistically what you would do. But there's a noticeable difference between honey, sugar, sucrose, aspartame. Most people would be able to distinguish the difference between them. Salt might be a bit trickier to tell Himalayan salt versus, let's say, lava salt or whatever it is. But you're right. That's kind of the penny has just dropped there. That maybe it has something to do with the language as well. Because even though we know that there are different types of sweetness, we would still call it all sweet.
The language is a really interesting concept, and maybe because my undergrad is in communication science, and only later I went in computer science. So the way how humans talk to each other is super important. And it's that non-verbal expressions which is really exciting. And now I remember, it's the sensors, the advances in sensor technology, which might also help to capture your non-verbal reaction to certain stimuli. So if you take I'm really not familiar with the different salt types, but Himalayan salt versus table salt.
Table salt, yeah.
You might still refer to it as salt, but what if I attach some sensors on you and I can capture the different muscles movement in your cheeks, which might give me an idea that there is a different reaction and sensation that is emerging based on that different stimuli. And if I then can help you to verbalize maybe the nuances of differences in the two stimuli. And that's something I try to kind of over the last now 15 years to hone in my research, because I'm using this specific methodology called microphenomenology or explicitation interview technique, which helps you to verbalize subjective experiences in a way where you might not have been aware of, but the way the interview technique helps you or is formulated, and the questions are formulated around how and what, it helps you to unfold your experience, how it kind of delivers over time. The form of how and why question posed to the person help you to verbalize how an experience unfolds over time, but also how an experience is configured in a specific moment. So it has two key dimensions, a diachronic and a synchronic dimension, which you then analyze. And based on that, we can start capturing these details in what is salty, in its particular changes over time, but also how they might differ. And I have applied that now to taste, touch, and smell as much as I can, in addition to quantitative or self-report method where you just tell me or predefined descriptors. So it's also about the skill of verbalizing. And you as chef or perfumers, you have a much richer kind of vocabulary than us lay people. But I think that is what we also miss in human-computer interaction. How do we describe the experience you want to develop or design for? And we need to capture them in order to be enabling this kind of interfaces and interactions we want to develop.
That's fascinating. Just picking up on one thing then, you triggered this idea in my head, or you sparked this idea in my head. Years ago, there's a French physical chemist called Obrist. He's one of the kind of, let's say, godfathers of molecular gastronomy that kind of coined the term. I think originally it was molecular and physical gastronomy. And I remember reading a paper, it wasn't a paper, it was an article that he had written when he was working with a chef called Pierre Gagnère in France. And I still hadn't met Professor Spence at this point, so I wasn't kind of so introduced to the world of academia outside of having just gone to university myself. But he wrote about questioning what does love bring into cooking, right? And I must have read this paper about 25 years ago or something, and he was saying that as a chemist, as a scientist, you don't really think about love and the impact that would have. As a chemist, he's looking at much more kind of tangible measures when it comes to cooking and let's say perfecting cooking in some way. But he said, what about the things that we can't see? What about things that we can't affect through kind of chemistry and the chemistry of the ingredients? What about what the chef or the cook brings to that experience? And the way he said that you could potentially measure love was, let's say, your respiration rate, your heartbeat, your pupil dilation, I don't know, little kind of measures like that. Do you think that would ever be possible to measure, so in the same way that you said we could identify, let's say, how I perceive salt or different types of saltiness? Would there be ways of measuring the the amount of love that someone's putting into their food? Is that something that's quantified? Is that possible, or is that just a completely balmy idea? And if it's completely balmy, then I'm going to again say that this belongs to a French scientist, and the idea comes from him. But it captured my imagination. And now with you talking about kind of sensors for measuring these kind of things,
I think it's a really exciting question, and I mean, I don't. So how do I answer that? So love is a concept where I think we can go into a lot of philosophical discussions, right? But then again, there's research in our field. They aspire to measure happiness, and we measure emotions all the time. And I mean, depending on who you ask, well, can we measure emotions? What do we define as emotions? I mean, these single snapshots of our affective responses, is that really enough to capture it? And so I think there are certainly ways of measuring it, in sense of combining your own verbalization of how you feel and maybe combine it and triangulate it with some sensor data on how your body responds. But it will very much depend on the stimulus in front of you. I mean, I could imagine a really interesting experiment where you put a couple in an experiment and you try to measure it in some way. I don't know yet how.
Well, now
just one. There is this researcher in the US. He did this slicing method where basically he recorded a short conversation between a married couple. And based on the analysis of that, I don't remember, 1 minute conversation, he determined if they will stay together or get divorced. It's really interesting because they slice it in different and they analyze it from a psychological point of view. It's the tone, it's the other kind of aspects in the voice that they analyze. So I could imagine if you really understand and define love, then you could start studying it. It's like we made a
Or I
difference.
guess it could be even happiness or sadness. Like, does the food taste better if you're cooking while you're happy versus does the food taste kind of a bit off if you're feeling sad or melancholy in some way?
Yes. I think it's a really interesting question that if you just go with, I think sometimes I take inspirations from movies, and often when you see movies where they're cooking and they're crying, then it's like you feel it through the food, or when they're very happy and put all their passion in it, then it's this kind of explosion of magical experience. So obviously, I don't know, you most likely answer that question better than me, but I think we always try to measure and quantify everything. As we try to do with experience as well, we try to define what is an experience. But experience, I mean, can you really grasp it? It's really difficult and it changes. And I think what technology can provide is maybe you cannot just have one instance where you say, this is love, this is happiness, this is an experience, but you have to have this over time continuous monitoring and capturing of how love, happiness expresses itself in order to start learning what it is. And then maybe you get a better understanding of what it is and what it isn't. But there will always be, in my opinion, a gray zone where you cannot fully know. But if we could understand love, we could definitely use it to make better, again, for me, interfaces which could help overcome some of the challenges of increased loneliness in older people or even younger people, as we have seen during the pandemic. So I think there is definitely an interesting space for exploration.
That's not completely crazy.
No, I don't think so.
So, Marianna, everyone who joins us on the podcast, we want to, I'm quite into this whole generative AI and using, especially kind of creating text to image. And I guess the reason that I got into this was just out of curiosity to kind of, there's a lot in the news about all these technologies. But then I kind of realized it was a great creative tool to stimulate ideas for the types of dishes that we create, both visually, the visual presentation, but also some of the kind of narrative and story behind them as well. And for everyone who comes on here, we create a dish that we think is kind of based on either their character, their work, or so this is for you to take with you, and we'll show it on the screen for people to see. But this is an image that I've created on Midjourney, and I'll tell you the little story kind of behind it. So number one, it's a weighted, double-walled, frosted glass bowl. The weight giving it kind of tactility and that sense of kind of presence, and the frostedness on the glass as well, because you get that nice kind of, that very satiating sensation of, at least what I find, satiating sensation of kind of frosted glass that's kind of matted on the hands. And it's weighted, obviously, to give it a certain sense of value and tactility there. It then has built into it, obviously, color-changing LED lights, so you can change the color depending on the tone, the dish, or the sequence maybe where it comes in the menu, that you can change the color in some way. We've added a diffuser in there, so you can change the aromas, because obviously your work looking at aroma, so we thought, well, it would be great to maybe have a dish that has that visual element of it, I guess, stimulating or nudging people towards kind of engaging their sense of smell, because when you see kind of smoke coming off a dish, you're more likely to, so having that kind of visual cue, but also the aromatic kind of component. And we also thought that it would be interesting if, like in those kind of diffusers that you have at home where it's kind of bubbling away, you hear this gurgling, bubbling noise, that would add an almost sonic element to the dish, that this dish and almost kind of bubbling away in that nice kind of muted way. And then finally, the actual dish that we put on there, or the ingredients we decided on were a kind of salmon sashimi style dish with spring greens on it. We kept that part quite simple, but really it was about developing a vessel that we thought took inspiration from your work.
Thanks very much. This is amazing. I think I never had a representation of myself through a dish. And I don't know if you intended it, but the red center heart, I almost felt that was the passion. I sometimes try to hide a little bit because I'm always getting too excited about things, but I love it. Thanks
Well, there you go.
Thanks.
Marianna, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. Where can people pick up your book, and what's the title of the book again?
So the book which I edited, the book that I co-edited with Carlos Velasco is entitled Multisensory Experiences Where the Senses Meet Technology, published by Oxford University Press, and you can find it at Oxford University Press, but also on Amazon, for example.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your passion and your knowledge with us, and I'm looking forward next to coming to your lab.
Yes, please do visit our multisensory devices group for more multisensory experiences.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for having me.
No, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.